What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Keegan, and this is a video lecture for our end of the week session, our asynchronous session online. You're working through some material in our Conceptual Foundations unit, and I thought I would provide a pretty guided video this week just to get you started on some chunkier concepts because we're just getting our feet under us as a class. So this lecture is about concepts, challenges, and methods in queer historical investigation. And this is meant to go along with the readings that I assigned on Blackboard under that asynchronous model. So just to get started here, queer history has a number of kind of built-in challenges when we look at conducting it, because queer lives are lived differently than straight and cisgender lives. So there are specific challenges to investigating the queer past. And one of these is one that we already kind of discussed in our first session, which is that studying LGBTQ topics is socially stigmatized. So people might wonder why you're taking a class that focuses on LGBTQ history. There are students that are, I think, a little leery of taking a class in LGBTQ studies alone, just because doing so kind of puts you in the position of being questioned in terms of like, why are you interested in that, right? So we know that interest in these topics is still stigmatized because LGBTQ people are still oppressed in our culture. So there's that initial problem. There's also the issue of where do you go to find stuff about queer people in the past? Because heterosexuality is normalized in our society, people with non-normative sexualities and genders are frequently erased. So not only does stuff go missing, but stuff is actually actively deleted or destroyed. So a lot of records of that queer past are missing because of this stigma. And then these issues of visibility and evidence, which are needed to create histories, are often exactly what is erased from specifically queer lives, right? So whether it's queer people themselves, like burning diaries or love letters, or having relationships that were not formalized through any kind of legal process, right? Those things don't get recorded and therefore fall out of history. Queer people do this ourselves, and then other people also do it to us. And then when we think about LGBTQ history, we're also often kind of projecting this idea of what LGBTQ is like into the past, when that's not necessarily accurate. So modern conceptualizations of the community or of identities really don't carry into the past the way that we might assume. So when we go looking for those things in the past, we might not find them because people's understanding was entirely different. And then lastly, this idea of a public queer political community is a really new phenomenon in the US. It goes further into the past in Europe and in other continents, but in the United States, as it exists today, we've really only had a queer community for under a century. So there's not a lot of like publicly recorded documentation of this like community and politics. It's new in a certain kind of way. So those are some of the like challenges with investigating this. Now, some history does exist, and we're going to be doing some historical investigation in the class, particularly in terms of how discourse evolves. So I did want to give you at least this one small example of queer history, which is a history of the term queer itself. So I'm just going to play this and give you a really quick background into how this word went from meaning sort of a pathologizing or stigmatizing term to a positive term. And you'll notice that a document we already looked at, Queers Read This, comes up in that history and is linked to that history.
From its humble beginnings in the 1600s to its still controversial use today, the word queer has always been, well, queer. Queer can mean something different to everyone who uses it, and we love it for its versatility and its resilience. So, how much do you really know about the history of the word queer? The Oxford English Dictionary credits the 16th century Scottish people for coming up with the word queer in the flighting of Dunbar and Kennedy, a poetic war of words that involved accusations of sexual perversion or weakness. Picture a rap battle, but in kilns. Hey, here comes our own queer clerk, one rogue battler tells another. But the guy's not necessarily gay, just eccentric and suspicious. The first person to use the word queer as a homophobic slur was John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry in 1894. His son Francis was the private secretary to Lord Rosebery, and the two were rumored to be carrying on a scandalous affair. After Francis died, his father wrote a letter to his younger son, Lord Alfred Douglas, denouncing snob queers like Rosebery and blaming the Lord for the elder son's death. The thing is, Alfred himself was one of acclaimed author and so-called first modern homosexual Oscar Wilde's literary muses, and they wrote each other love letters for years. When Douglas found out about the affair, he made it his personal mission to take down Wilde, and it worked. Wilde was later arrested, eventually found guilty, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Other, crooked, and bad became synonyms for queer for years, and the use of the word queer reached its height of popularity in the late 1920s, as the term also became widely known in America. But New York's Stonewall riots in 1969 marked the beginning of the gay rights movement in the US. And from the start, members of the community called themselves queer as an act of defiance, as they celebrated their right to love who they want, even in the face of police violence. Yet that age of sexual liberation in the 1970s turned into tragedy in the 1980s. More than 16,000 Americans died of AIDS-related complications in just 5 years, most of them gay men. The AIDS crisis sparked an era of activism in a time of grave crisis, and this had a large influence on young activists, who took up the word queer as a badge of courage. This culminated in the founding of the Queer Nation in 1990 as AIDS continued to ravage the LGBTQ community. And at New York Pride in 1990, they passed out, "Queers read this. Being queer is not about a right to privacy. It is about the freedom to be public, to just be who we are." For the first time, the world was hearing, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." The work of these queer activists inspired a shift in art, culture, and academia, as institutions questioned the heterocentric norms of Western culture. With the rise of the internet came digital queer communities and a new wave of LGBTQ activism. Bills like Prop 8 in California and the larger national fight for marriage equality moved a new generation of activists to organize and fight for equality. The internet's ability to connect people and spread information at a rapid pace cemented the term queer into a modern generation's lexicon. Now, a wide range of LGBTQ people and other sexual minorities call themselves queer as a more expansive and expressive umbrella term for their sexualities and genders. Also, not everyone in the LGBTQ community loves the word queer. There are plenty of trans folks and older gays and lesbians who just don't jive with the term. But as our movement evolves beyond just the L and the G in our ever-growing acronym, the proliferation of the term has been seen by some as an overwhelming positive, reflecting a more inclusive approach to our politics and our community. We're all stronger together and queerer than ever.
Okay. So back to our slides here. That's kind of a crash course in how this term queer developed. Sorry, you can hear, I think there's a recycling truck going down my street, so I apologize. The crash course and the history of kind of how this word has a relationship with politics and identity, right? And the way terms are used can change wildly just in a couple of centuries. So it's kind of amazing that there are younger people today who don't realize queer even had this stigmatizing history. It comes out of a history of criminalization and stigmatization of gay men particularly. But today is used as an umbrella term, as a kind of resistant term. And we saw that with Queers Read This, which was key to kind of leading that shift in the way the term was used. So that's just a little bit of how queer history can be laid out. I want to talk a bit about normative historical models and the problems they pose to queer histories. So we talked already in class about how normative approaches to history tend to center the most powerful groups. So if you are someone who's taken a history class in college or even in K through 12, you'll notice that most history is framed around kind of the like canonical histories of powerful white men who colonized this continent. And that's still very much, and like anything that happened before that, we're not really taught. And that's still very much how US history is approached at a kind of introductory level. So one of the problems is that, you know, people with power show up in history a lot more vibrantly than the people they may have oppressed or taken things Also, normative historical models tend to be linear, so they start one place and end one place, right? And they try to draw like linear through lines between those events to make sense of what happened. We see that with our own history, like when did the US begin? Or, oh, the Revolutionary War. Well, there were people here before that and before that and before that, right? Like, where do you place the timeline beginning? And that choice makes a big difference in what kind of story you end up telling. So we also have this idea that like we're progressing as a nation as we move forward in time, which is a very Enlightenment kind of assumption that like democracy gets better over time. We might be questioning that right now, maybe as a country. So that's another kind of normative model that kind of creates this kind of flattening, right? So we have to think about straightness as a concept, not just as an identity, to think about how history produces straight lines or lines of connection that maybe are actually more complex when we look carefully at what took place. And these assumptions, right, powerful social groups being centered and linear timelines tend to produce errors. And there are two basic errors that the reading discussed that obscure the complexity of LGBTQ lives and histories. The first is what we call the monolithic error, which is this idea that all LGBTQ people share essential identities across time and space. So mono meaning one, right? There's this idea that there is one way to be gay or one way to be lesbian. And the way that we investigate the past is we go looking for people who look like contemporary versions of those identities. And so, or we go to another culture and assume that like queerness there will look like queerness in our culture. And so this is a big problem when we start investigating across history or across, say, like ethnic or cultural lines, this monolithic error that we assume things are the same. Two is the teleological error, which is this mistake we make that when we assume that LGBTQ history follows a progress narrative in which things are like always getting better and the past was always more oppressive and the future will always be more liberated. That's not true. And actually what we see in queer history is much more of a push-pull kind of relationship with power. And we'll talk a lot about that in class, but things are just not automatically getting better. And the past, actually, there were times in specific areas in the US in the 1970s where queer people had more rights and protections than they do today. So this would be also a false assumption. So how do we queer history? How do we mix it up, deconstruct it? To queer something is to like draw out its non-normative qualities or potentials. Well, we want to avoid those two errors and we want to replace them with methods, right? So in LGBTQ studies, when we're investigating history, we use queer or anti-normative methods that help us get around those errors. The first of which is something called perverse presentism, which is something that we're going to try to practice in this class. And this is just, it sounds complicated, but it's really just an approach where we keep in mind that because sexuality and gender have changed over time, and because they vary widely across cultures and geographies, that we can never really project our current understandings of them into the past or onto other cultures. And so we have to constantly act as if we are occupying the same present as the historical figures we're studying. We have to assume, we can't assume that we can't bring any more knowledge that we have now into the past, because that twists and distorts our understanding of how these people might have understood themselves. So in other words, there's not just our present and then the past in a linear or binary relationship to one another. There are many presents, a perverse number of them. And when we go into the past, we're actually just skipping to a different present that people were living in that we haven't experienced. Two is this idea of social construction, which you might know if you've taken a gender studies class, which is that sex, sexuality, and gender, we're taught that they are fixed in our culture, but if you look carefully at them, you'll see that they actually change wildly over time and across culture, so that they have no fixed meaning outside of cultural beliefs and social behavior. And so sex and gender in a different time period, people are going to have completely different understandings maybe of what sex and gender are than we do today. So they're socially constructed and not necessarily determined by nature or biology. There are aspects of them that are, but not the totality of them. And three, something called desubjugation. When you desubjugate something, you move it out from underneath something that is pushing it down, right? To subjugate is to push down or oppress or cover up something, and to desubjugate it is to move it out from under that structure. So what we do is, like, rather than focusing on the most obvious powerful groups, which in the LGBTQ community are like white cisgender gay men, right? That's been the group that has been very centered in like normative sort of gay rights and gay history models. A queer studies approach would say, well, that history is important, but what can we learn by moving that centralized story over a bit so that we can see what's underneath it. We can see what space it's taking up and who might be in there, right? So we try to find what is covered up by or hidden even inside of most of the privileged histories that we learn, because, you know, white gay male history also contains like white bi male history, right? Like the bisexual men who are partnered with gay men, but whose stories just get subsumed into this idea of gayness without any attention to those differences. So desubjugation is about moving things over so that other things can come into view. And we're going to be doing all of this in class. You'll notice that this class focuses a lot on the histories of people that we don't normally think of as being central, like trans people, people of color, poor queer people, and people who are normally centered don't play a central role in this course because we're trying to discover something new. We're conducting a queer investigation, meaning we're looking for non-normativity. We're trying to do non-normative kinds of inquiry. So one thing I want you to do is, as you're kind of getting ready to write your reading journal, is to go back to the readings and kind of take a look at how they structure history, how they give you a structure in which they're packaging a historical narrative. I assigned the Eckler, which is just a long timeline, to really get you thinking about, like, what are some normative models of LGBT history, and then what are some queer models. So the Eckler reading, right? If you take a look at when it was published, like what's on the timeline, and then where does it end, and what has happened since that's not represented, is always a good thing to think about, because the achievement of something like marriage equality or the Title VII Supreme Court ruling this year would radically change maybe how we might even construct that timeline to alter what might have led to it, right? Past events might become more important once something happens in the present. So looking at when it was published, it's about 10 to 15 years ago, I think, that it came out. So there are things missing. If we look at the timeline, this is a linear timeline, right? So my cat is quiet, you. My cat is meowing at me. She thinks I'm talking to her. If we look at the timeline, it's linear, right? This is someone trying to produce like a straight timeline for GLBT, as they call it in this reading, history. So you'll notice the timeline begins actually with the subjugation of indigenous North American people by colonizers, right? So what does it mean to root queer history in this moment of like indigenous removal? What about the native queer practices of indigenous peoples who called this continent home for much longer than white settlers, right? So rooting it there is a very white lens. And then it proceeds in a very kind of linear fashion that prioritizes major cultural works by white people and gay people particularly. And then also court cases, or so the courts play a huge role in documenting kind of like challenges in this timeline. So how does this affect our concept of queer history? We might start thinking, oh, queer history is about law, and it's about novels, and it's about white people, mostly, right? If we read this timeline. Now, if we look a little more carefully, we might notice there are some changes in language and terminology. And there are things that are different now. We no longer say GLBT, we say LGBT. That's a change that came along after kind of like the late 90s, when lesbian women's efforts during the AIDS crisis were really recognized by switching the order of those letters to honor women first and men second. That's something that is not happening in this timeline. you might also notice that the T is included, but where is the trans history in this timeline, right? We see a kind of nominal inclusion of trans without really any work documenting history of trans people that would be separate from or distinct from gay history. So those are some problems already with the way that this reading is packaging queer history, or we could say there are limitations. No historical representation is going to be perfect, right? But there are investments and design elements here that are causing certain effects on us as readers. So one thing to kind of intuit when you look at a past document like this is to think about what you might be able to guess has changed in the last decade of queer history based on how it was represented in the past. And we could say, obviously, trans people have become much more of a focus than in the past. And also, there seems to be been some discussion about gay men's kind of privileged position in the community since we had this timeline come out. So doing some of that kind of investigative work, understanding that representations of history are not complete and that they create impressions and assumptions on our part as readers, is part of the process of what we're doing in this class. So instead of linear history, we're trying to follow a much more what we would call mixed and confusing model in this course, where we are covering about 500 years, but we're leaping several centuries in just a couple of weeks, and then we're slowing way down and paying attention to a span of 3 years for maybe like 2 to 3 weeks, because this class uses a much more accordion style model for history. And we're also looking at a lot of different voices. We're trying not to center any one group. While much of LGBTQ history is mapped onto a struggle for rights, right, which this Eckler timeline really does, there's a lot of focus on law and rights challenges. There are also histories like the history of queer culture. In this course, we're going to be looking a lot at major cultural formations that queer people have developed that are related to what's happening in politics and law at the time. There are histories of queer social formations like communes and bars and parades and polyamorous families and all kinds of different kinds of social networks, activist organizations that queer people have developed to deal with the pressures of dominant society. There's queer language or discourse, which we're going to be investigating quite a bit to look at how people take up words to name their experiences and to bring things into reality that have been latent. And then there's the history of like queer dress and expression, which we can also dig into. So there are all different kinds of aspects of history. One question people like to kind of ask when they do history is to say like, well, are things getting better at least? And I think it's a really hard question to answer, because one of the difficult and intersectional realities of queer history is that gains for some LGBTQ people are often won at the expense of others, whether it's like gains for white queer people made at the expense of people of color, whether it's gains for cisgender, gay, and lesbian men and women at the expense of trans people, right? We're going to be looking carefully about the intersectionality of this community and how that has played out historically. So are things getting better? It depends on who you are. And we also know that LGBTQ language and identity do not develop in straight lines. They have narrowed and broadened based on political conditions, community needs, activism. So again, narrow, broad, instead of straight line of development that's easily traced is a model we're going to be looking at in class. So one final idea here, and this is from the Berlant and Warner piece, Sex in Public, that little clip I had you read of this article. I know this is a dense reading. This is actually a piece of queer theory, very fundamental to establishing the concept of heteronormativity, which is this idea that being straight is considered normal in our culture, and therefore all institutional aspects of American culture expect people to be straight. Which was an idea we had to actually develop as queer theorists. Like, there was no name for that before this piece came out in the early 90s. This piece comes out right alongside Queers Read This in the early 90s, and you can see how activists and theorists are thinking about these problems kind of connected together. Just in two different discourses. One is an activist discourse and one is an academic discourse, but they're basically naming the same problems. So in this foundational essay, Sex in Public, queer theorists Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner develop a concept of world making to describe how queer culture functions. And I've clipped out the area where they talk about this quality of queer culture that they call world making. And according to these theorists, queer culture, there are all different kinds of queer culture. It's as diverse as the queer community. And yet they say that there are distinct qualities that make queer culture queer and not something else. And they describe these qualities as what they call world making. And so we are going to be looking at a number of examples of queer culture and world making queer praxis or practice in this class. To look at how, like, why do queer people make culture? What drives us to make different kinds of cultural expression? And then what are the relevant historical traditions and trajectories of the dominant forms of queer culture in the United States? So Berlant and Warner say there are like 4 basic qualities queer culture has that make it queer and not something else. Remember, queer meaning non-normative. They say queer culture is not just about sexuality, although sexuality is included in this, but they say it's actually about desire. And that could be desire for sex, sure. Or they say more largely, it's about desiring and imagining another kind of world. That queer culture is world making because it desires the world to be different than it is. And wants to transform the world into a world where queer people could experience joy, survive, and express themselves safely. So there's always this like kernel of utopian desire that queer culture possesses and expresses. Second, it produces relationships outside of normative social models. So in our culture, normative social models are, right, citizenship under the nation state, the married heterosexual couple, the biological nuclear family, and ownership status over objects. Those are kind of like the dominant relational models in our culture. And Berlant and Warner are saying actually queer culture tries to find other ways of relating outside of these kind of dictated relational models, whether it's ownership. I mean, men used to be considered to own their wives, right? So property and the family are really tied up with one another. And then also like and the idea of being a good citizen and following the rules, even when those rules are oppressive, right? So queer culture would question those relationships and it would say, we want to find other ways to exist outside of these that are more expansive and permit for more types of human expression. 3, Berlant and Warner say that queer culture is rooted in a history of what they call criminal intimacy, which is basically a fancy way of saying that queer people have a shared experience of being criminalized in the United States and punished for their gender and sexual expressions. And that this group experience of criminalization and stigma drives a lot of the expressions in the culture, right? What if the world didn't criminalize us? What if the world didn't stigmatize us? It comes out of that shared experience. And 4, queer culture is fundamentally about, quote, elaborating a public world of belonging and transformation, unquote. And here we see it's not just about desiring another world, it's about demonstrating how that world could be. It's about showing people, here's how we feel and relate to one another, and here's how you could do this too, if you would just come along with us and develop these different relational models. So elaborating means to show, to like make, to display and lay out something. And this belonging, right? Everyone gets to belong and everyone gets to be who they are, transformation. So every time we look at a cultural formation in this class, whether it be next week, we're gonna look at indigenous practices in the United States, we're gonna look at the Bay Area Two-Spirit Powwow as a world-making space. We're gonna look at pride parades, we're gonna look at queer collectives and communes, we're gonna look at political formations like the Queer Manifesto. All of these are expressions of world making in different ways where queer culture is saying, hey, this world is pretty crappy. Like what the systems we're using don't really seem to produce transformational relationality or let people express themselves safely. So here's what we could be doing, right? So I want you to think about each of these cultural formations, looking at these four aspects, and we'll touch back on these. Now, I wanted to give you one example of world making, which is something that comes out of the AIDS crisis. But before that, I wanted to just quickly show you where in this piece Berlant and Warner describe these qualities. So at the top of 558, they write, by queer culture, we mean a world-making project where world, like public, differs from community or group because it necessarily includes more people than can be identified, more spaces than can be mapped beyond a few reference points, modes of feeling that can be learned rather than experienced as a birthright. What they're saying here is that queers become queer through contact with culture. Queer culture is what makes us queer. And if you think about that, it's kind of true. Like queer people, queer and trans people, we are not necessarily born into families like us. We don't learn to be queer from our parents or from heritage or ethnicity, or we learn queerness by coming into contact with cultural formations, not social formations. And so they're saying like queer culture is world making because how does anyone learn or figure out that they're queer, right? No one comes along and says, hey, want to be gay? Instead, you have to figure out how to speak the language of queerness or gayness or transness through these kinds of formations, like pride parades, like bar spaces, like activist communities, right? At the bottom, they say, we are trying to promote this world-making project as a first step in doing so. And a first step in doing so is to recognize that queer culture constitutes itself in many ways other than through the official publics of opinion culture in the state, right? They're saying to find queer culture, you have to look outside the mainstream because mainstream culture is just reproducing the systems that exist. Whereas like non-dominant culture or outsider culture is where we're going to be focusing in this course. And it's culture that's kind of like you could miss if you didn't look for it, right? So queer culture is about kind of finding these like secret transformational spaces or having these like implicit relationships to culture that are shared by other queer people. Making a queer world has required the development of kinds of intimacy, right, or relationship that bear no necessary relation to domestic space or the home, right, to kinship, meaning biological relationships, to the couple form or nuclear family, to property or to the nation. Queer culture comes from outside of those relationships. And so that is what they're describing is what we would call a queer counterpublic, meaning a group of people that exists outside of the dominant modes of production in the United States. Okay, so we're going to be looking at these communities as we study this. Now, I wanted to give you this example of how this can take place. One example of queer world making is what we call the kiss-in. Now, the kiss-in, we're going to be seeing people do this later on in class when we study the AIDS crisis. It's a practice that developed during the AIDS crisis where activists would actually go to public spaces that were dominated by straight people and they would make out in public and they would like freak out all the straight people. And, it was meant to do a couple of different things. It was meant to disrupt the space and whatever was happening in it. So a lot of these AIDS activists would go to places like hospitals that were turning away HIV positive gay patients. Refusing to care for them. They would show up and they would like kiss in the space. And what this really does is it would kind of like weaponize people's homophobia against them. They like, it would show people, one, that kissing is safe and you can't get HIV from kissing somebody. So that's not a thing. And two, like we're gonna force you to reckon with the fact that this space is not safe for queer people. And we're going to make that obvious by triggering a homophobic reaction in you. And you can see how in some ways this is very much similar to like the rules for straight people in Queers Read This, right? It's like flipping around the social relationships and the power dynamic in a space to reveal who has power and who doesn't. So activists are actually still doing this. I'm going to show you an example of this that happened recently. And this is a bunch of queer people who are organizing to talk about queer rights globally, right? So this kiss-in happened recently around fears of like sort of global gay rights and queer rights being kind of under attack in this recent period.
As queer Americans, it is our duty to stand for the rights of queer people all over the world. And it is by an act and affirm that we have the privilege to stand here today and kiss the people we want to kiss without putting our lives in danger.
Queer lives are under attack. What do you do? Stand up, fight back. Queer lives are under attack. What do you do? Stand up, fight back. Love is legal. Hate is legal. Love is legal. Hate is legal. Love is legal. Hate is legal.
All right, so that's just a quick example of a form of world making that activists have been using for now, what, 30, 35 years, to demonstrate, you know, how space is still dominated by heteronormativity. Like, think about how often you see queer people kissing in public. It's legal to do it. It didn't used to be, and we'll talk about that. It used to be criminalized. Very recently, up until the late 1960s, it was actually illegal to kiss like this in public. It was also illegal to have gay sex, consensual gay sex, in I think 16 US states up until 2003. So criminalization is very recent and ongoing for people. And it's because culture is so overdetermined by heteronormativity and cisnormativity that something like this feels dangerous and transformational when you see it happening. It's why it still works as a form of protest today, you know, 30 years after activists developed this technique. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully this helps integrate some of the material for you and gives you some thoughts about what you're gonna write in your reading journal. So please do make sure to file that by Sunday evening, and I'll look forward to talking with you and seeing what you wrote next week, okay? I'm gonna stop the share and end the meeting. Thanks a lot.